This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 183 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. In this episode, I will be bringing you my commentary from episodes 176 and 177, which were the first two episodes in the Reading is Fundamental series. What I'm doing this month is just giving you some shorter episodes, which are some additional commentary from the Reading is Fundamental series that I did in the month of September. So these episodes will be a little shorter, and we'll be resuming the schedule of once a week episodes in the month of October. And then in November, we'll be resuming our normal routine of the longer episodes once a week. What I wanted to discuss today is my commentary on whether or not we should be incorporating work on etymology into reading and spelling instruction, commentary on using a hierarchy and morphological complexity, play-based versus playful learning, and the idea that phonics instruction is boring. So I will start with my commentary on etymology, which is something that I discussed in episode 176 with Dr. Wasowicz. So to give a little context, Dr. Wasowicz has done a lot of work with the connection between language and reading and writing. And in the episode, we discussed the Language Literacy Network, which is a framework that she built to elaborate on the reading rope and to really help professionals understand how writing can be incorporated into this whole concept of literacy, how we're not just talking about reading, we're talking about writing and spelling as well under this broader umbrella of literacy. And so there are a lot of components to both, but one that I've seen debated a lot is the component of etymology, which is really the origin of words. So when we're looking at roots and bases and affixes, we're considering whether or not there's a Latin origin or a Greek origin. And so there are different opinions on this topic. On one side, there are some people who feel like it adds additional context because the word's origin can give additional information based on how a word might act, for example, how you might pronounce a morpheme. So because some people feel that that gives additional information about why words are spelled the way that they are, they think that it should be a necessary component to spelling and reading instruction. And there are many people who incorporate this into their instruction on word decoding and their study of words, as well as when they're working on skills like morphology and orthography and phonology, they're weaving work on etymology into those discussions. And my biggest question was, is this a necessary component? How deep do we need to go in building kids' awareness? So as I discussed in episode 176, there really isn't a lot of research that shows definitively that etymology is a necessary component to teaching spelling. However, we know that skills like phonological awareness and morphological awareness and just this broader concept of metalinguistic skills, metalinguistic awareness, all of that has a wide body of research to support it. However, that being said, there are many who are using etymology as one of those components. They're weaving it in, and they're finding that their students enjoy it. So my take is that it is not something that I include in my framework that I teach as of now. It's definitely something that I continue to revisit the research to see if there is something that I need to add to the frameworks that I teach. I certainly think that if students are interested in it, and if you find that it adds to your discussions with students, if it helps you to have an additional tool to help explain why words are spelled the way that they are, by all means, I see no issue with incorporating this into your instruction, especially if it's helping students stay engaged. But I think the main thing that I want people to take away is that if you are working on metalinguistic awareness, if you are working on helping students to look at the words and critically think and be aware of the linguistic units and the patterns and the orthographic patterns in the words that they're looking at, you don't necessarily have to know everything about linguistics in order to effectively help your students. And that leads me to the question of morphological complexity, especially as it pertains to vocabulary instruction, as well as morphological study. So in my program, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I do give a resource called the Word Study Toolkit, where I give a number of morphemes. There's a lot of prefixes and suffixes. I give some homonyms. So it's just a resource with a lot of different probes that you could potentially use for word study for your students. But it isn't scaffolded. And the reason that it is not scaffolded is because any of the vocabulary word lists that I provide, because I do have some other ones where I've got some tier 2 word lists, the way that I want you to see those is not as a curriculum, but rather a list of words that gives you a tool or a starting point for studying words with your students, because I want you to feel comfortable. I want you to see lots of examples, and I want you to have tools at your disposal that you can use so that you can play around and study words with your students. How I teach SLPs to create a framework is to focus on those bigger picture elements to make sure that they are building students' vocabulary skills, that they are embedding components like phonology, morphology, orthography, semantics, and syntax. And the way that I help them do that is I give them core strategies for studying morphology, for studying semantics and syntax. And I do provide some structure and scaffolding. For example, for thinking about different syntactic structures, I do create somewhat of a hierarchy for you. So this isn't to say that there is no hierarchy with language, but what I find is that a lot of SLPs specifically feel like they can't get started unless they know this hierarchy of I'm going to start here and then I'm going to work up through all of these skills. And I find that people tend to get lost in the weeds. So is there a way that you can work through a hierarchy when you're working on vocabulary or morphology? Are some morphemes used more frequently than others and therefore higher priority? Are some more difficult than others? Absolutely. But do you have to know a perfect hierarchy before you can get started working on morphology with your students? Absolutely not. So the way that I provide things is to give you the structure so that you can get started. Now, many programs, and there are a ton of examples that I can give. There's Wilson, there's Orton Gillingham, there's Lindemood Bell, Spelllinks would be another one. Many of these programs give a robust curriculum that allow you to study words with your students. And the challenge that a lot of professionals have, and one example would be SLPs, because that's who I created Language Therapy Advanced Foundations for, don't necessarily have the time to fully implement a lot of these programs. So is it beneficial for SLPs and other practitioners to continue to deepen their knowledge and get additional certifications? Absolutely. I always encourage people to continue to deepen their knowledge. But the main thing that I want people to take away is that you can start working on word study with your students sooner rather than later. You don't have to know everything. What I often advise clinicians to do is to collaborate with their teachers, see what curricular materials are being used, and to use that as a starting point for prioritizing. Ideally, language therapy should be delivered on top of a robust reading curriculum. So in a perfect world, there would already be some hierarchy with the phonological skills and the morphological skills that are being delivered in the curriculum. That is what I always advise people to do, is to look at what's going on in the curriculum and utilize that to make decisions about what to prioritize in therapy. However, I know that there are many times when that is not the case. And that's why I do provide you with some materials and examples to get started so that you can feel comfortable with some of your strategies, help building your students' awareness, and get to the point where maybe you can talk to your leadership about advocating for some changes at the curricular level, which I know is easier said than done, but that is why I have designed things the way that I have. Now I wanted to move on to talking about play-based learning versus playful learning and the idea that phonics is boring. So in episode 177, I have a great discussion with Anna Geiger, who is a former teacher and who is the host of the Triple R Teaching Podcast. I was a guest. You can check the show notes for the link to my interview with Anna on Triple R Teaching. And she is also the owner of The Measured Mom, where she provides resources for reading for educators and parents. So one of the biggest objections that Anna had to teaching phonics when she was a proponent of balanced literacy was that she thought it was boring, but she didn't realize that she was actually leaving a lot of students behind. And she gave some great examples in her interview about how some students, and she's got many examples in some of the training materials that she offers, of students being really excited to do certain activities that on the surface might seem like they're boring. For example, a student just reading through a word list and realizing that they can pull the words off the page and being so excited about just going through a list of words, using strategies, using phonics skills, using phonological skills to pull words off the page and getting so excited about that. And that's often said to be something that's really boring, or it's going to make kids hate reading. And the main thing is that you can't feel confident and excited about something if you can't do it. So I think it's really important for us to shift that narrative that phonics is boring. And I would add study on morphology. That's one of the biggest objections that I get when I say we need to work on syntax, we need to work on morphology. When students feel lost and they don't have the ability to pull the words off the page, when it's so laborious that they're spending so much energy trying to decode that they can't comprehend and get the big picture, or when it's so difficult for them to understand one sentence because they haven't been exposed and they haven't developed those syntactic skills, then of course reading isn't going to be fun. So at the beginning, yes, it's very normal for students to be resistant, especially if they have had a very challenging experience with reading, but it's really doing students a huge disservice if we don't support those skills. And of course, we do want to do a lot of shared book reading as well. It's not only phonics lessons, but we want to embed them together. And so there's this shift from the leveled predictable text to decodable text. And I think that's a really important distinction, that a decodable text is allowing kids to apply those phonics skills. It's allowing kids to practice those skills that they've done in their phonics lessons, whereas a predictable text is just giving additional context and actually encouraging some of those bad habits, such as look at the first letter and guess the word, or look at the picture and guess the word. Whereas the decodable texts are actually encouraging kids to look at the word and use their phonics skills and apply those skills. And I think that just common sense, when you think about this, if a student is out just walking down the street and they see a street sign, they're not going to be able to use the syntactic structure to decode that street sign or a picture. So we need to equip students with the skills that they need in order to read words out of context in a decontextualized situation. And when I say decontextualize, I mean that maybe there's not additional words or sentences that are going to give them a cue about the word. For example, reading a street sign, you don't have a sentence around that street sign giving you a cue about what the word is. Now, maybe if it's in a neighborhood where you're familiar what the streets are, then you can read the sign. But if you're in an unfamiliar place, well, it's going to be very difficult for you. So it's very important that we understand how to recognize some of those strategies that have unfortunately gained traction that are teaching kids to read poorly. And again, that's the 3 cueing. So things like using syntactic structure and pictures and the first letter of the word to guess the word. Now, context is important. Yes, we want to teach kids syntactic structures. Yes, once students have decoding skills, it does make sense for them to use context to learn vocabulary words, but that's very different from teaching kids to use context to decode words. So that distinction is very important. I'll wrap up with the discussion of Finland, because this did come up in my conversation with Anna Geiger, where we discussed the whole idea of playful learning versus play-based. So again, there are many situations where play-based learning is very appropriate, and allowing kids to have unstructured play. We know that it's great for cognitive development. So kids should have ample time to do that. But we also know that students need explicit instruction in order to learn the alphabetic code. So play is great, but it is not going to teach kids to become literate. So for the younger students, yes, we can start embedding some of that work. We can embed phonological awareness. We can embed some print symbols into preschool, and it can be very playful and enjoyable and developmentally appropriate, especially when we have things like shared book reading. So we're not talking about making kids sit in desks for 3 hours at a time or anything like that. So I think that distinction is really important to make, that yes, we absolutely should be embedding literacy into early curriculum. And no, it doesn't need to be boring drill-based. It can be very playful. A lot of times, this is where the art of teaching comes in and can be embedded with the science of teaching. The final thing I wanted to pull out of my conversation with Anna is the discussion of Finland. So she made the point that many people say, well, in Finland, they start teaching reading way later and they do just fine. So we should be doing that in the US. So Finnish has a relatively consistent orthography, whereas English, it's a lot more complex. So many times the argument of when we should be teaching reading is a little bit more complicated than people realize when we're comparing to other countries. So the comparison of when we should be teaching reading when we're talking about a completely different language is sometimes an apples to oranges comparison. So while there are probably a lot of very good practices happening in Finland that we can certainly model, we need to consider the language that we're teaching when we are thinking about the US schools. So that's something that I don't see mentioned very frequently within that discussion. And I think it's something that we need to remember. So this wraps up my commentary on episodes 176, Building the Language Skills for Reading, Writing, and Spelling with Dr. Jan Wasowicz, and episode 177, Debunking Reading Myths and Defining Literacy Buzzwords with Anna Geiger. So check the show notes for links to both of these episodes. I will also link to the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. There is still time to get 25% off when you join either program. That goes through October 15th. To get that special rate, all you need to do is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. Again, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program for speech pathologists and related professionals who want to create a framework for language therapy. And again, I go into a lot of the components that I discussed today. I give you a framework for building vocabulary. I teach you strategies for supporting students' morphological, phonological, and orthographic awareness, as well as give them strategies for building semantic skills and word retrieval and supporting syntactic development. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program for related service providers who want to put programming in place to support students' executive functioning. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And for either program, remember, between September 15th and October 15th, you can get 25% off when you enter coupon code RIF25. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De facto Leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.